The year was 1857, deep in the heart of Mississippi, where the river bent like a serpent and the air was thick with secrets. The summer came early that year, hotter than the devil's breath, and the land itself seemed to groan beneath it. Corn withered before it ripened. The cattle refused to eat. And down along the Willow Creek plantation, something else began to rot, something far worse than the crops. They said the plantation had been cursed since the day it was built, even before the first brick was laid, before the soil was turned. The elders of the nearby town of Natchez warned the man who owned it, Silas Ward, to build elsewhere, but Silas wasn't a man who listened. That he was born into wealth, raised on the idea that the world bowed to his will. His father, a stern Virginia colonel, taught him early that mercy was weakness, and weakness was sin. By 25, Silas had inherited 3 plantations, 200 workers, and a reputation for cruelty that stretched from Mississippi to Georgia. They said he once whipped a man until the lash snapped, then reached for another. They said he smiled when others flinched, but no one dared say it to his face. Willow Creek was his crown jewel, a mansion with 20 white columns, acres of riverfront, cotton, and a private chapel built for a god. Silas no longer prayed to at night. The house creaked like something alive. The wind moaned through broken shutters. Candles burned low in windows long after midnight, though no servant claimed to light them, and every so often, when the fog rolled in thick from the river, locals swore they could hear screams echoing across the fields. Most thought it was the wind, others weren't so sure. On the first night of July, a storm came down over Mississippi like the wrath of heaven. The skies split open, and the rain fell sideways, hammering the roof of Willow Creek. Silas Ward stood alone on his porch, watching the lightning crawl across the horizon. His eyes were empty, the kind of eyes that had seen too much blood to ever look clean again. That he didn't flinch when thunder shook the earth. He didn't move when wind tore the branches from the trees, but then he heard something, faint at first, then louder. A voice at first, he thought it was the storm itself. Then came the sound of knuckles striking wood, 3 sharp knocks at his front door. He turned slowly, his boots echoing against the marble floor. No one ever came to Willow Creek uninvited. Not anymore, but there she was, a figure standing on the porch, soaked to the bone, her shawl clinging to her frame like shadow. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the lightning flashes, and in her hands, she carried a small wooden box, wrapped in black cloth and tied with frayed ribbon. Silas stared at her for a long moment. The storm howled around them, tearing at his coat, snapping the lantern chain. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice flat as the river. The woman's lips trembled, not from fear, but from rage barely contained. "I've come for what was taken from me," she said. Silas frowned. "And what might that be?" The woman's eyes, ice gray, sharp as glass, met his without blinking. "My family." Silas said nothing. But behind his cold stare, something flickered, recognition. He stepped aside, his jaw tight. "Come in, before the rain kills you." She crossed the threshold, and at that exact moment, lightning struck the oak tree outside, the same oak where, years ago, Silas had hung a man for daring to run. The tree split in 2. And though the thunder masked most sounds, Silas could have sworn he heard something else, a whisper, crawling through the cracks of his house. A voice he hadn't heard in years. A voice that should have been dead. Inside, the woman set her box down on the table. The air in the room shifted, heavy, unnatural. The flames of the candles bent sideways though no breeze blew. "What's in the box?" Silas asked. Her answer came slow, each word a blade. "The truth." She untied the black ribbon. When she lifted the lid, Silas took a single step back, not from surprise, but from the cold, creeping realization of what he was looking at. Inside was a child's locket, tarnished silver, with the initials E.W. engraved into the metal, and beneath it, a photograph, old, faded, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Silas Ward, standing beside a woman and a small boy. The same woman now staring at him, older, broken, but very much alive. "You remember now," she whispered. "Don't you?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't have to, because for the first time in 15 years, the butcher of Willow Creek felt something he thought he'd buried long ago. Not guilt, not sorrow, fear. And outside, under the pounding rain, the river began to rise, as if something deep beneath it had started to stir. The storm raged long into the night, battering the windows of Willow Creek until it seemed the sky itself wanted in. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of rain-soaked wood and candle smoke. Silas Ward stood by the hearth, his eyes fixed on the woman who now sat in his drawing room, the first stranger to enter that house in nearly a decade. She hadn't said her name yet, she hadn't needed to, there was something about her presence. Something familiar, though he couldn't place it, the way her hand trembled when she brushed wet hair from her face, the way her eyes darted to the staircase every few seconds, as if she knew the layout of the house already. Silas poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his hand steady despite the trembling lamp flame. When he offered her a drink, she shook her head. "I didn't come here for comfort," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm, like a blade that had been sharpened for years. Silas leaned against the mantel, studying her in silence. Lightning flashed outside, and for a brief instant, the walls of Willow Creek looked alive, shadows stretching long, like figures trying to claw their way out of the wood. Finally, she spoke again. "You remember the flood of '42? Silas frowned. "I remember a lot of things. The river took everything that year," she continued. "Crops. Livestock. Whole families. You rebuilt Willow Creek on the bones of what the water left behind." He said nothing. Her eyes flicked to the black box still sitting on the table, the child's locket gleaming faintly in the candlelight. "My boy. Elijah," she whispered. "He was 6. He used to run through these halls, chasing the cat. You remember, don't you?" Silas's expression froze, then hardened. "I don't recall," he said. The lie hung in the air like smoke. She smiled sadly. "I didn't expect you to." She rose from her chair and walked slowly toward the window. Rain streaked down the glass, and in the reflection, Silas saw something move, just behind her shoulder. A shape. Small, there, for only a heartbeat before fading. When he turned, there was nothing, only the hollow sound of wind beneath the floorboards. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the fire burned low, Silas found himself alone in his study, or so he thought. That he tried to write. Tried to think. But every time the pen touched paper, he felt eyes on him. He glanced toward the door. Empty, then toward the mirror, and froze. Behind him, in the reflection, a small handprint smeared across the fogged glass. Child-sized. He spun around. "Nothing." The woman's voice came from the doorway. "You feel it now, don't you?" she said softly. Silas didn't respond. "Willow Creek remembers," she continued. "The river remembers. And so does he." He rose slowly from his chair, anger replacing fear. "What do you want from me?" he snapped. She stepped forward, her wet dress dragging against the floorboards. "I want you to remember the night the river took my son," she whispered. "And how you let it happen." The memory hit him like a whip point. 15 years ago, the flood, the chaos, the screams from the workers' quarters. He'd ordered the levee open to save his mansion, knowing the current would sweep through the lower fields, and drown anyone caught in it. He told himself it was just business. That the land could be rebuilt, but some things don't stay buried. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Silas sat in the dark, watching the rain crawl down the glass. Somewhere deep in the house, a piano began to play, soft, slow notes echoing through the hall. Only one person had ever played that piano, Elijah. The melody was faint, but Silas knew every note. He rose from his chair, moving down the hall toward the sound. The closer he got, the colder the air became, like walking into a cellar filled with ice. The music stopped. He entered the music room, candle in hand. The keys of the piano were pressed down, as if invisible fingers had just left them. On the bench sat a single object, the same silver locket that had been in the woman's box, but this one was open. Inside was a lock of dark hair, and a drop of dried blood. From the far end of the hall, he heard footsteps, light, uneven, childlike. They stopped just outside the door. "Who's there?" he called. A whisper answered, "Papa." The candle flickered, then went out. Morning came gray and silent. The woman was gone, but her box remained on the table, and on the front porch, carved into the wood by a knife, were 3 words that hadn't been there the night before: "He's not gone." Silas traced the letters with his fingers. The grooves were fresh, the wood still bled. He turned to the fields beyond the porch, where the fog still clung to the earth like a second skin. Somewhere beneath that fog, the river whispered, the same rhythm, the same name, again and again: "Elijah, Elijah, Elijah." And for the first time, the butcher of Willow Creek realized the past wasn't finished with him. That it had just begun. The morning after the storm, the skies over Mississippi hung low and swollen, pale gray clouds dragging their bellies across the treetops like ghosts too tired to leave. The air was thick with steam rising from the soaked earth, and the river, still swollen from the night before, whispered against its banks. Inside Willow Creek, the house felt wrong. That it was quiet, yes. But not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. That it was the kind that listens. Silas Ward walked through the empty halls of his mansion, his boots echoing off the marble like gunshots. Every sound seemed to stretch too long, every creak, every sigh of the wood. He had lived in this house for 20 years, but that morning, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The woman from the river was gone. No footprints on the porch. No sign she had ever been there at all. Only the black box remained, and the locket he had found open by the piano. He tried to convince himself it was all a trick. A cruel reminder from the past. Maybe she wanted money, or vengeance, or both, but deep down, Silas knew better. He'd seen her face. He'd heard that voice, and last night, he had heard the one word he'd buried in his heart for 15 years, Papa. By noon, the servants had returned from the quarters. They moved quietly, heads bowed, avoiding their master's gaze. They had their own stories about the night before, whispers of figures moving through the fields, lights in the fog, the sound of a child's laughter echoing across the cane. Rose. Silas ignored them. He wasn't a man who believed in superstition, but that day, as he passed the grand staircase, something made him stop cold. There, on the third step, small, perfect, and wet, was a footprint. Bare. Child-sized. It glistened faintly in the light, as though the boy who made it had just stepped out of the river, and beside it lay something else, a single button, small and white, carved from bone. He picked it up slowly, turning it in his hand. He remembered it had belonged to a little shirt he once bought for Elijah, before the flood took him. His breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, Silas felt something close to panic. He dropped the button and backed away, heart pounding. The sound of whispering followed him, soft, like the wind through reeds, but there was no wind, and the whispers weren't coming from outside, they were coming from the walls. By dusk, Silas had locked himself in his study. He poured another drink, his hand shaking as he brought the glass to his lips. The fire burned low, and the shadows on the wall seemed to move on their own. He thought of the woman, the way her eyes had looked straight through him, the way she'd said, "He's not gone." Who was she, really, and how had she known so much about that night? He searched his desk, pulling out old ledgers, letters, and journals, until he found what he didn't want to find, a name scrawled in the corner of an old plantation registry, Mary Ellison Ward. The handwriting was his own. His wife, dead 15 years, but the woman who had come to his door, looked just like her. He read the name again and again, as if repetition could change the truth. Then came the sound, that same piano, again, playing that same tune, Elijah's song. He froze. The melody was soft at first, but then stronger, richer, as though unseen hands were mastering the keys. Silas rose, his face pale in the candlelight. He stepped into the hall, following the sound, each note pulling him deeper into the dark. The house seemed longer tonight, its corridors stretched, warped, bending toward some unseen center. He reached the parlor door and pushed it open. The piano played on, though no one sat before it. Every candle in the room burned steady, but their flames were blue, and on the piano bench lay a small toy horse, carved from wood. He knew that toy. He'd made it himself, for Elijah's birthday. It had been lost in the flood. Silas picked it up, his hand trembling. Then the piano stopped, silenced. He turned slowly toward the mirror above the mantel. In the reflection stood a child, wet, pale, eyes wide and empty. "Elijah," Silas whispered. The boy didn't move. He just stared, his mouth opening slightly, and when he spoke, the words didn't sound human. "They said you'd forget me, Papa." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of 15 years of water and mud and broken prayers. Silas staggered back, shaking his head. "This isn't real," he muttered. "You're not real." The boy smiled faintly, a smile too sad for any child. "You made a choice," he said. "And now the river's come to collect." The reflection flickered, then vanished. The mirror cracked down the middle. Silas's heart pounded as the house around him groaned, beams creaking, glass rattling in the frames. The floor trembled, as if something beneath it was moving, something vast and restless. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest, gasping for breath, and in the distance, through the roar of the rising wind, came another sound. The slow toll of the chapel bell. It rang once, then twice, then stopped at an no one had touched. That bell in 15 years. Outside, the river had risen over its banks, flooding the lower fields again, same as the night his son died. The fog crept in thick and low, swallowing the fence posts, curling up the walls of Willow Creek like living smoke, and from the mist, something was watching. A figure, motionless, its face hidden beneath a veil, the same woman from the storm. She stood at the edge of the field, silent, unmoving. And as the lightning flashed, Silas saw that she was holding the black box again, only this time, the lid was open, and something inside it was glowing faintly, like a heartbeat. That night, Silas didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the fog, waiting for dawn that never seemed to come. Somewhere deep in the walls, the piano keys began to move again, one note at a time, like a child practicing, and beneath the house, he heard the faint sound of water rushing, louder with every heartbeat. Willow Creek was waking, and what was buried beneath it, was coming home. By the third day, Silas couldn't sleep. He tried everything, burying the black box beneath stones, tossing it into the river, even leaving it at the crossroads where old wives said the devil waits for lost souls. Yet every morning, when the sun bled over the Georgia fields, the box was back on his table. Same spot. Same dust ring beneath it. That he stopped speaking to the hands at the mill. The workers whispered that he'd gone queer in the head, that maybe the fever had come back. But Silas knew it wasn't fever. Fever doesn't whisper to you when you're alone. Fever doesn't laugh in the dark. Each night the box seemed heavier. The first time he'd lifted it, it had been no more than a few pounds, dense, but manageable. Now, it felt as if it contained the earth itself. His hands shook when he tried to move it. Once, he dropped it on the floor and heard the faint sound of glass shattering inside. But when he opened it, the inside was as black as ever. No glass. No light. Just a void that seemed to breathe. He began dreaming of the plantation again, of his father's hand on his shoulder, the smell of blood and cotton thick in the air. But in the dreams, his father's face was wrong. It was covered in ash, eyes glowing faintly from the hollow sockets, and the voice, it wasn't his father's anymore. Open the box, boy, it said. Open it and see what your silence bought you. Silas woke with his sheets damp and his breath caught in his throat. He lit a lamp and stared at the box until dawn, watching it as if it might crawl away if he blinked. By the end of the week, he'd made his way to the edge of town. There was an old preacher there, Reverend Calloway, a man who lived half in scripture and half in whiskey. Folks said he could talk the devil out of a man if he had enough moonshine in him. Silas found him sitting on the porch, hat tipped low, muttering over a Bible that had lost half its pages. "You're Silas Reed," the preacher said without looking up. "Your daddy was a cruel man." Silas froze. "You knew him?" "I knew what he did." "We all did." But nobody spoke, did they? The preacher finally looked up. His eyes were milky, blind but piercing all the same. "You got his sins on you like tar." Silas hesitated, then unwrapped the cloth bundle he'd been carrying. The black box sat there on the preacher's lap, gleaming faintly even in the dim morning light. "I want it gone," Silas said. "It won't stay gone." Calloway ran his fingers over the lid. "It ain't meant to leave you. Some debts can't be burned away. They got to be carried, till they eat what's left." The preacher whispered a prayer, something low and trembling, and for the briefest second, the air around them shifted. The cicadas went quiet. The wind died. Then the box trembled, just slightly. Calloway's face twisted. "You didn't tell me it was his box." Silas blinked. "Whose?" "The overseer's," the preacher hissed, backing away. "The one they said burned in his own house, night your father took ill. You brought his ghost into your home, boy." That night, Silas returned to his cabin and bolted the door. He didn't light a candle. Didn't touch the box. He sat in the dark and listened. It began softly, like breath against wood. Then came the faint tapping, like fingernails dragging across the lid. "Open it." The voice was clearer now. Not imagined. Not inside his head. It came from the box. Silas pressed his hands over his ears, shaking. No, open it. The shout rattled the walls, and suddenly the air was filled with the stench of charred flesh. Silas stumbled back, choking, eyes watering. The shadows on the walls twisted and flickered like fire, then silence. When he looked again, the box was open. Inside, there was no void anymore, just a faint light, like the glow of dying embers. And in the light, a face began to form, ashen, burned, eyes glowing white like river stones. The overseer, you remember me, the apparition said, voice bubbling like tar. Your daddy said I was vermin. Said I was nothing. But you watched me burn. Silas couldn't move. His throat felt locked. You stood there, boy. You let it happen. The overseer's grin widened, grotesque and cruel. So now you'll watch again. Watch yourself burn. Silas screamed, and the lamp burst into flame on its own. The curtains caught next, then the walls. He stumbled outside, gasping, as his home went up in fire, but when he turned back, there was no smoke. No fire. The house stood untouched. The box sat on the table, lid closed. For the next few days, Silas didn't sleep. Didn't eat. Every reflection showed his face growing paler, thinner, hollow-eyed. People said he'd gone mad. Some said the devil had marked him, but Silas knew better. It wasn't madness. It was memory, and the box, it wasn't cursed. It was truth. He'd been a boy that night. His father and the overseer had fought. There had been whiskey, torches, and rage. Silas had hidden beneath the porch while the screams tore through the air. He'd watched through a crack as the fire consumed the overseer's house. And when the screaming stopped, his father had come out, covered in soot, smiling. Some men need burnin' to remember they're mortal, he'd said. Silas hadn't spoken of it since. Until now, and now, the box had come back to remind him, sins buried by fire don't stay cold forever. Dawn came slow that morning. A gray mist rolled in from the marshlands, clinging to the cotton fields like a burial shroud. Silas sat on the porch, eyes hollow, fingers trembling as he held a tin cup of cold coffee. He hadn't slept since the fire that wasn't. The image of the overseer's charred face still burned behind his eyelids every time he blinked. He thought of leaving Georgia. He could head north, to Tennessee or beyond, maybe find work where nobody knew the Reed name. But something deep in his chest told him it wouldn't matter. The box would follow. It always had. By mid-morning, the workers at the mill started talking. They said they'd seen strange lights by the old Reed plantation the night before. Some claimed it was lightning, others said it was the ghosts of the burned. A few swore they heard singing, low, mournful, carried on the fog. Silas tried to ignore it. But then the wind shifted, and he smelled it again, smoke. Not from the mill, not from any hearth. It was the same thick, greasy smoke that had filled the air the night the overseer died, and underneath it, something else, the faint, bitter scent of burned hair. By noon, Silas saddled his mule and rode toward the old plantation grounds. The road was overgrown, lined with the bones of what had once been white fences. The house itself loomed ahead, half swallowed by vines, its windows dark and empty like eye sockets. He hadn't been back there since his father's death. The place still felt alive somehow, like the walls were breathing. He dismounted and tied the mule to a post that looked ready to crumble. Every step he took toward that front porch felt heavier. The closer he got, the louder the air seemed to hum. Inside, the house was a ruin of rot and memory. Dust hung in the air like mist, and the floorboards groaned under his boots. He moved room to room, guided by some pull he couldn't explain, until he reached the study, his father's study. The desk still stood where it always had, warped and sun-bleached. On it, half buried under cobwebs, was an old ledger. Silas brushed it off, coughing as the dust rose. The ink had faded, but the names were still there, lists of men and women, ages, prices. Human lives, tallied like cattle. His hands shook as he turned the pages. Near the end, there was a different list, short, written in a hurried, unsteady scrawl, 9 men. Overseers. Punished by fire. The date, August 9, 1853. Silas froze. His father hadn't just burned the overseer that night. There were others, and as he ran his finger down the page, he saw something else, a signature at the bottom. Not his father's. C. Mathers. The name hit him like a hammer. Mathers had been the preacher before Calloway, the one folks said lost his mind and wandered into the swamp, never seen again. Silas stumbled back, the ledger falling to the floor. He turned to leave, but a sound stopped him. A faint, dragging scrape, like boots on wood. He turned toward the doorway. A figure stood there. Half in shadow, half in the dull light filtering through the broken windows, the overseer, but behind him, others began to appear, 8 more, faces blistered and blackened, eyes pale and glowing. They filled the room without sound, their presence colder than the grave. Silas backed away, heart hammering. "What do you want from me?" The lead specter stepped forward. Its jaw moved stiffly, bones cracking as it spoke. "The truth," it rasped. "Your father's truth. Our truth." Silas shook his head. "I wasn't him." "I didn't, you watched," the voice interrupted. "You watched and you remembered. Now you carry it." The ghost's eyes burned brighter, and suddenly Silas felt heat, searing, blistering, crawling across his skin. He screamed and stumbled back, clutching his chest. The black box had appeared again, resting on the old desk, lid wide open. Inside, the light wasn't dim anymore, it was blazing, flickering like a furnace. The room itself began to shimmer, transforming before his eyes. He wasn't in the study anymore. He was outside, standing in a field, but it wasn't overgrown. It was alive again, the cotton tall and white beneath a cruel summer sun. The plantation was whole. The air rang with the sound of whips, of chains, of distant crying, and his father stood there, young again, smiling with that same cold pride. "Some men," his father said, "need to be broken to understand the order of things." Silas wanted to shout, to move, to stop it. But he couldn't. He was frozen, forced to watch as his father and the overseers argued, then turned, together, toward the slave quarters with torches in hand. The fire spread fast. Screams filled the air. Silas fell to his knees, hands pressed over his ears, tears streaking his face. When he opened his eyes, the fire had reached him. He looked down. The box was in his hands, glowing white-hot, the heat burning his palms, but he couldn't drop it. The voices screamed inside it, echoing through his skull. Then, darkness. When he woke, he was outside again, lying in the mud near the ruins of the plantation. The sun was setting, blood-red over the horizon. The box sat beside him, untouched, cool as stone. He sat up slowly, shivering despite the heat. For a long moment, he just stared at it, that cursed piece of wood and iron that had followed him across miles and years, and then, for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt understanding. The box wasn't a curse. It wasn't vengeance. It was memory, all the pain, the fire, the cruelty. It had to live somewhere. Someone had to carry it, and the Reed family, for all their sins, had built their fortune on the backs of the damned. Maybe this was their inheritance. That night, Silas buried the box again, deep this time, beneath the burned oak tree that marked the heart of the old plantation. He whispered a prayer he barely remembered from childhood, then walked away without looking back. But as he crossed the hill, the wind shifted. The earth behind him groaned, and faintly, under the soil, came the sound of tapping. Once. Twice, then silence. Silas didn't turn around. He just kept walking, into the fog, into the unknown, but the faintest smile crossed his face, because for the first time in years, he finally felt free. For days after he buried the box, Silas wandered. He followed the river south, sleeping wherever darkness caught him, drinking from creeks, eating little more than wild berries and bread gone stale. Each night he told himself it was over, that the voices were gone, that the past was finally put to rest. But the world around him didn't seem to believe it. The air felt wrong. Heavy. The wind no longer moved the way it used to. When he walked through the tall grass, it swayed against the direction of the breeze, brushing his legs like fingers. By the fifth night, he found himself near the edge of a small settlement, a cluster of shacks and workshops belonging to freedmen who'd stayed on the land after the war. They called the place Elder's Hollow. A few of the old hands remembered him. They looked at him with suspicion, as though they could see the ghost clinging to his shoulders. He didn't blame them. There was an old woman there, Miss Ada. She'd been a midwife once, before her hands started shaking. She lived in a shack with herbs hanging from every beam and jars filled with things Silas didn't dare name. When he came to her, she didn't ask what he wanted. She just stared at him for a long, silent moment before saying, "You buried something that wasn't yours to bury." Silas froze. "How do you know?" Ada smiled sadly. "The ground told me. The soil's gone sour since you came this way. Things dying that ought not to die. Birds fall from the sky, wells gone bad. You carried something with you, Silas Reed, something that don't stay put." He sank into the old chair beside her door, rubbing his temples. "I buried it. Deep. I swear I did." "Then the earth refused it," Ada murmured. "And that means it's still hungry." That night, the settlement didn't sleep. The dogs barked without pause, howling at something that wasn't there. Chickens flapped madly in their coops until feathers littered the ground. And the air, it hummed again, that same low vibration Silas had heard in his father's study. He woke to the sound of knocking, not on a door, but from beneath the floor. 3 times, then silence, then 3 more. Ada's voice came from the corner, steady but shaken. "You hear it too?" Silas nodded. "It's the box. It's under us." The floorboards creaked, and suddenly one of them split down the middle. Cold wind rushed out from the crack, carrying the smell of ash and iron. From beneath the boards came a whisper, faint, breathy, familiar. "Silas," he staggered back, heart hammering. "No. I buried you." The boards buckled again, and Ada stumbled forward, clutching her chest. "Lord help us," the whisper became a roar, dozens of voices layered atop one another, wailing, pleading, screaming. The shack's lantern burst, and in the darkness, faint light began to leak from the cracks in the floor. "Run!" Ada shouted, but Silas didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the light, growing brighter, hotter, until the floor exploded in a flash of white. When the smoke cleared, the room was empty. The light was gone. So was the box. Only the mark remained, burned into the dirt beneath the floorboards, the shape of a hand, clutching a key. The next morning, Ada found Silas sitting by the river, staring into the current. His clothes were damp, his face streaked with soot. She sat beside him in silence for a while before saying, "Whatever it is, it's bound to you. You can't bury memory, Silas. Not when it's soaked into your blood." He turned to her slowly. "Then what do I do?" "Find the root," she said. "The first sin. Where it began. You pull it out, maybe the land breathes again." Silas thought of his father's ledger, the page marked August 9, 1853. 9 overseers punished by fire. Maybe the box wasn't just a memory. Maybe it was a record, a vessel for the ones wronged, a ledger of its own. That if that was true, then there was still something left unfinished. That night, Silas dreamed again. But this time, the fire was gone. The world was silent, black, and cold. He stood in the middle of an endless field, the soil wet and red beneath his feet. A voice spoke, not the overseer, not his father. Something older. Something deeper. "You carry their weight, Reed. You think that makes you righteous. But you are only the next chapter." Silas looked down and saw the box again, resting in the mud. It was open, light spilling out like a pulse. Inside were faces, hundreds of them, eyes wide, mouths open in eternal scream. "Where does it end?" he asked. The voice replied, "Where it began." When he woke, he knew what he had to do. By the following evening, he had gathered supplies, a shovel, a lantern, a flask of whiskey, and set out toward the swamp. That's where they said Mathers had disappeared. The preacher whose name was written beside his father's in the ledger. The man who had helped burn 9 men alive. If the root of the curse lived anywhere, it would be there, in the place where faith and sin had drowned together, the swamp was silent as he entered, except for the chirr of insects and the slow, sucking sound of mud beneath his boots. The trees hung low, their branches like fingers, draped with moss that swayed though there was no wind. Hours passed before he found it, an old church half sunk into the muck, its steeple crooked, bell rusted through. The door hung open, swinging gently. He raised the lantern and stepped inside. The pews were broken, the altar split. But in the center of the room was something else, a pit, wide and dark, carved straight into the earth. He knelt beside it and saw that it wasn't empty. Inside lay bones, charred, fused together. 9 sets, maybe more, and among them, half buried in ash, something glinted. The box. Silas's breath caught. He reached for it slowly, fingers trembling. The moment his skin touched it, the world seemed to tilt. The ground shuddered. The air filled with the sound of weeping. He lifted it from the ashes, and beneath it, a single word was carved into the dirt: confess. Silas stumbled back, shaking his head. Confess what? I wasn't there. I didn't light the fire. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He had been there. He'd watched. He'd done nothing. Tears burned his eyes as he fell to his knees. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry for what we did. For what I didn't stop. The box pulsed once, twice, then opened. Light poured out, filling the church, spilling through the cracks in the walls, rising toward the night sky like a column of fire. Silas covered his face, crying out as the light enveloped him. When it faded, he was alone again. The pit was empty. The bones were gone. The box lay silent, cold, and still. He closed the lid gently. For the first time, it didn't resist. He whispered, it's over. But outside, in the distance, thunder rumbled, and the wind carried faint laughter through the trees. Elders Hollow had always been a quiet place, too quiet, some said. The kind of place where the crows never left, and the fog hung low enough to feel like a living thing. But after that night in the swamp, silence took on a different shape. It wasn't peace anymore. It was warning. When Silas came stumbling out of the swamp at dawn, covered in mud and ash, the first thing he noticed was the smell. The air carried the sharp tang of rot, not the natural kind, but something older, fouler, like meat that had never lived to begin with. By the time he reached the edge of the settlement, he knew something had changed. The fields were dead. Rows of corn stood brittle and gray, their stalks snapping in the wind like dry bones. Chickens lay stiff in the coops, and the well water shimmered black beneath the morning light. Miss Ada stood near the center of town, staring into the distance. When she saw him, her eyes filled with fear instead of relief. You went to the swamp, didn't you? She whispered. Silas nodded. I found it. The church. The bones. The box. Ada's voice trembled. And you brought it back with you. He looked down at his hands. They were empty. No, he said, I left it there. Ada shook her head slowly. No, you didn't. You can't. That thing's not a box, it's a doorway. And you opened it. That evening, the people of Elders Hollow gathered by the fire pit in the center of the clearing. There were maybe 20 of them, most too afraid to speak above a whisper. They looked to Silas as though he were both savior and curse. He told them everything. About his father. The ledger. The 9 overseers. The preacher. The swamp. The box. When he finished, the crowd was silent. The fire crackled. Someone in the back muttered a prayer, then a man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes sharp as a hawk's. His name was Jonas. He'd been one of the first freedmen to settle in the hollow, a man of faith and temper alike. You say this thing carries the sins of your kin, Jonas said slowly. But now it carries ours too. Silas frowned. What do you mean? Jonas pointed toward the horizon. There, beyond the trees, faint lights flickered, like lanterns moving through the fields. But there was no one out there. No sound of wagons. No voices. Just the glow. Ada whispered, they're walking again. The others backed away, clutching crosses, rosaries, whatever they could find. Jonas turned back to Silas. If it's your blood that brought this here, then it's your blood that'll end it. That night, Silas couldn't rest. He lay awake in Ada's shack, staring at the ceiling as the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. Every few minutes, he heard footsteps outside, slow, dragging, too heavy to belong to the living. That he peered through the window and froze. Figures were moving through the fog. Dozens of them. Pale, translucent, their faces burned and hollow. The overseers. The enslaved. The dead. They weren't attacking. They weren't speaking. They were remembering. They traced the outlines of the fields, the paths between houses, the land that once held their blood. And as they moved, the earth itself seemed to tremble. Silas stepped outside, heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the mist. The figures turned toward him, and for a moment, all sound stopped. The night held its breath. Then a voice rose, faint, but clear. "Tell their names." Silas froze. "What?" "Tell their names," the voice repeated, now louder. "Say what was taken." He realized then, they didn't want vengeance. They wanted to be remembered. By dawn, Silas had gathered the townsfolk again. He told them what he'd heard, what the voices had said. Some wanted to flee. Others wanted to burn the fields, salt the ground, and start anew somewhere else. But Ada stood firm. "They ain't a skin for blood," she said. "They're a skin for truth. For the story to be told proper, not buried with the liars who made it." So they gathered near the old reed plantation. The house was nothing more than a skeleton now, its roof gone, its bones blackened by age and fire. Silas stood before the ruins and opened the ledger he'd taken from the study. The pages were nearly falling apart, but the names were still there. He began to read point one by one. Men. Women. Children, their ages. Their prices. Their lives reduced to ink and numbers. As he spoke, the air began to shift. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and soil. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The people of Elders Hollow joined in, repeating each name aloud. Their voices grew stronger, rising together until the sound filled the valley, and in the distance, the lights began to fade. One by one, the glowing figures dissolved into mist, until only a single form remained, the overseer. He stepped forward, face calm now, eyes no longer burning. "You've done what your father would not," the ghost said softly. "You've told the truth." Silas bowed his head. "Then it's done." The overseer smiled faintly. "Truth don't end things, Reed. It just makes the end honest." With that, he vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and the whisper of the wind. For the first time in years, the morning came clear. The sky burned gold, and the fog lifted from the fields. Birds returned to the trees. Silas stood there, staring at the rising sun, feeling something he hadn't known in decades, peace. But Miss Ada, standing beside him, didn't smile. She pointed to the soil at their feet. It was cracking. Splitting open, from within the earth, something black was pushing upward, slowly, deliberately. The box. Silas's blood ran cold. Ada whispered, "The earth remembers, but it don't forgive." The box settled into the light, its lid sealed tight, its surface unmarred. Silas stepped forward, staring down at it. "What are you now?" he murmured. The box didn't answer. But faintly, deep within, came a single sound, like a heartbeat, once, twice, then silence. The dawn after the reading of names should have been a day of peace. For the first time in a lifetime, Elders Hollow awoke without fog. The air smelled of wet earth, and the sun crept over the tree line like a shy apology. Children came out to play. Doors that had stayed bolted for days were finally unlatched. It almost felt like the curse had lifted, almost. But peace doesn't come easy to a place that's built on bones. By midday, the ground began to pulse. The people thought it was thunder at first, the far-off growl of a storm. But there were no clouds in the sky. Then the sound deepened, spreading beneath the fields, the homes, the riverbank. It was as if the very soil remembered something it had been forced to forget. Miss Ada was the first to say it aloud, "It ain't over." The ground's restless. Silas had been sitting by the well, the ledger still clutched in his hand. He hadn't slept since the night before. His eyes were hollow, but his mind was racing. He'd seen the box rise from the dirt. He'd heard that heartbeat, faint, slow, steady, and now, every few minutes, he swore he could feel it again, not in his chest, but beneath his feet. Each beat shook the earth, so faint it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. He set down the ledger and stared at the well water. The surface rippled, once, twice, in perfect rhythm with that unseen pulse. Then he saw it, a reflection. Not his own. A pale figure behind him, standing perfectly still. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the empty square, the whispering grass, and the low groan of the wind. Still, the reflection lingered in his mind, a woman's face, eyes wide with sorrow, mouth half open as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. He knew her. Or at least, his blood did point one of the names from the ledger. Hester. By evening, the town gathered again, not out of hope this time, but fear. The crops that had seemed dead now looked worse, their roots blackened, the leaves dripping a thick, dark sap that smelled like iron. The livestock refused to eat, the air itself felt heavy, as though each breath dragged you closer to the grave. And then there were the sounds, scratching beneath the floorboards, whispers through the walls, voices calling from empty wells. One by one, the people of Elders Hollow began to dream of faces they'd never seen, men and women crying out for something they didn't understand. Ada said it plain, they're not gone. They just found new ways to speak. That night, Silas walked alone into the fields. He couldn't rest, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but that sound, the heartbeat under the ground. He followed it to the edge of the swamp, where the earth was soft and the air smelled of decay, and there, half buried in the muck, was the box again. It hadn't moved. But it had changed. Carved into its lid were words, old, rough, scratched deep into the wood. Blood remembers. He knelt beside it. "I've done what you asked," he said aloud. "I've spoken their names. I've given them peace." The box gave no answer. He pressed his hand against the wood, and felt it pulse beneath his palm, not like a heartbeat this time, like breathing. He stumbled back, horrified. The ground beneath the box shifted, bulging upward as though something beneath it was alive. The whisper came again, this time from everywhere at once. "You told their names. Now tell your own." Silas's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You spoke for the lost. Now speak for the living." He looked around. The swamp was filling with light again. Dozens of glowing forms stood between the trees, watching him in silence. But these weren't spirits of the enslaved. These were newer, different faces he recognized, the people of Elders Hollow, alive, yet not. They stood frozen, eyes blank, their mouths moving without sound. The truth settled over him like frost. The curse hadn't ended, it had shifted. The dead were done haunting, now the living would carry it. By morning, the hollow was silent again. Ada went to check on Silas, but his cabin was empty. The ledger lay open on the table, the ink smeared by rain or tears. On the last page, he'd written only one line, "It's not the dead who refuse to rest. It's the truth that refuses to die." For days, the townsfolk searched. They found footprints near the swamp, a lantern half buried in mud, and a trail that ended at the edge of the water. Some said he walked into the mire and never came back. Others said the ground swallowed him whole. But Miss Ada, she knew better. She said the hollow takes what it's owed. And that night, when she walked past the well, she heard something down below. A faint tapping, like a heartbeat. She smiled sadly and whispered, "Rest now, Silas." But the tapping didn't stop. It answered. Weeks passed. Seasons turned. The crops grew again, but different this time. The corn was taller, darker. The leaves shimmered black when the wind passed through. The townsfolk didn't question it. They'd learned long ago not to ask too much of the land, but every now and then, when the sun set just right, you could see things moving in the fields, shapes that weren't shadows, faces that weren't alive. Children were told not to go near the swamp after dark. The well was sealed, and the ledger, the box, and the memory of Silas Reed were buried together, deep, under the oldest oak in the valley. Still, even now, when the storms roll in from the coast, and the thunder rattles the windows of the hollow, people swear they can hear it, that faint, rhythmic pulse beneath the ground. Not a curse, not quite, just the land remembering what it was made from, because some soil grows crops, and some soil grows stories, and some never stops growing ghosts. It had been 70 years since the name Elders Hollow appeared in a newspaper, the land had changed hands, the town renamed, and the past paved over by time and asphalt. What once was a graveyard of stories was now a cluster of forgotten farms and a newly built highway cutting through what the maps now called Route 17B.to most. It was just another stretch of rural America, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place people drove through without slowing down, but the land remembers, and some places don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig. When Nora Whitfield first came to the Hollow, she didn't know she was walking on a story that had never finished telling itself. She was a journalist from Atlanta, chasing local legends for a podcast series called Echoes of the South. She'd done episodes on ghost towns, abandoned plantations, and folklore that blurred the line between myth and memory. But something about Elders Hollow was different. She couldn't even find it on Google Maps. Locals only called it the stretch. A place, too quiet, they said, where your radio cuts out and your phone loses signal, even on a clear day. And then there were the stories, whispers of a heartbeat under the soil that could still be heard when the storms came. Nora thought it was just superstition, but she'd built her career on chasing stories that refused to die. So, one gray afternoon, she loaded her car and drove south. It started small, the air changing as she crossed the county line. Her dashboard clock flickered, the radio hissed, and the GPS spun in circles. When she stopped for gas at an old station, the attendant stared at her recorder and said, "You're looking for ghosts, ain't you?" "Well, this place don't got ghosts. It's got memory." He wouldn't take her money for the gas, just told her to leave before sunset. She smiled, thinking it was a warning meant to spook outsiders, but when the sky turned copper red and the wind picked up, even she started to feel it, that strange, living silence that hums under your skin. She parked near the ruins of what looked like an old church. The foundation was cracked, and the wooden sign had long since faded, but she could still make out two carved words, Elders Hollow. Nora set up her microphone and began recording. "This is Nora Whitfield," she said softly. "It's October 12th, and I'm standing where the town of Elders Hollow once stood. Locals say the ground here still moves at night, and that." She stopped at her headphones. She heard it, faint, but there, a slow, steady thump-thump under the static. She took off her headset, heart racing. Nothing, silence. She put them back on. The heartbeat returned. Thump. 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 She turned up the volume, and that's when the whisper came, "Tell the truth." She froze. It wasn't feedback. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, distant, female, trembling. Her hands shook as she stopped the recording and checked the playback, but the sound was gone. Only her own breath remained. Still, she knew what she'd heard. By midnight, a storm rolled in, lightning tore across the sky, and rain hit the windshield like stones. Nora couldn't leave. The road had flooded. She took shelter in her car, staring out at the field where the church once stood, and there, in the flashes of lightning, she saw them. Shapes moving in the mist, figures, tall, thin, still, watching. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The radio came alive again, static at first, then that same heartbeat, thump. 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 Then, clear as day, a voice said her name, Nora. She gasped and looked around. No one there. The sound came from inside the recorder. When she played it back, the voice continued, "Read the ledger. Speak the names." The next morning, the storm cleared, the land was quiet again. Nora stepped out of her car, and there, half buried in the mud by her tire, was an old wooden box. It was small, waterlogged, and marked with the faint carving of a circle split by a line. Inside were pages, fragile, yellowed by time. She turned one over and saw handwriting that froze her blood. Silas Reed. Page after page of names followed, some crossed out, others underlined. At the very bottom, one final message in fading ink: "For whoever finds this, remember. The hollow breathes what we bury." Her recorder clicked on by itself. The faint heartbeat began again, and then, another whisper: "You found what was lost. Now finish what was left undone." That night, Nora uploaded her findings from a motel room 50 miles away. She didn't add commentary, she just played the raw recording, the storm, the whispers, the heartbeat. Within days, the episode went viral. Listeners claimed to hear different things in the background: a woman crying, a man praying, a child laughing. Some said it was fake. Others swore it was real, but one thing was certain: Elder's Hollow was no longer forgotten, the story had come back to life, and as the plays climbed into the millions, and the comments poured in, the old soil stirred again, unseen, unheard by most, because now, the story wasn't trapped in the hollow anymore. It was in every home, every speaker, every ear that listened. The curse had found a new voice, and this time, it had gone digital. 3 months passed after Nora Whitfield's episode went viral. 3 million downloads, hundreds of conspiracy forums, and one sleepless journalist who couldn't stop hearing that sound when the room went still. Every time she closed her eyes, the beat returned, soft, steady, patient, thump, 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 like something waiting for her to answer. At first she tried to ignore it. She changed apartments, sold her car, even left her recorder sealed in a storage unit, but the heartbeat followed, through walls, through dreams, through the hollow silence between breaths. She finally gave in when the email arrived, from unknown@hollowmail.com. Subject: You never finished the story. Attached was an audio file. 31 seconds long, the voice was her own. The next morning she packed her microphone, a flashlight, and the old wooden box she had kept hidden since that storm. Destination: Elder's Hollow. The highway stretched empty for miles, the air heavy with static. Even the GPS refused to speak. When the road curved toward the swamp, the signal died completely, just as it had before, but this time, she wanted the silence. The church ruins were gone. The county had cleared the site for development. A billboard promised future home of 17B Logistics Park. Only the oak remained, its roots tangled around the foundation stones like a giant hand clutching secrets. She set up her recorder beneath it. This is Nora Whitfield, she whispered, returning to Elder's Hollow to record a final entry. If you're hearing this, I guess the story wasn't done with me yet. Wind swept through the branches, then came a low groan, the earth shifting, as if listening. She placed the box on the ground. Its lid was warped from rain, but the carving still glimmered faintly in the gray light. Inside lay the ledger pages, though she didn't remember leaving them there. They should have been in her apartment, locked away, yet here they were, dry and untouched, names, dates, lines written in the same hand that had signed Silas Reed, but at the bottom was something new, fresh ink, shimmering wet. Nora Whitfield, witness. Her breath caught. She hadn't written that. She looked up, heart hammering, but no one stood near. The oak rustled once more, and from somewhere deep beneath her came a sound like water bubbling up through stone, only it wasn't water. It was air, breathing. She turned on the recorder again. Silas, she said into the mic, voice shaking, if you're still here. I'm listening. At first, only static, then, a reply, thin as paper. Not I. We. The ground trembled, the roots twisted, cracking the soil. Something glowed below, pulsing with that same rhythm she'd heard in every playback. She crouched closer. What do you want? To be known. The pulse grew faster. The mud began to rise, taking shape, not bodies, but outlines of memory, hands reaching, faces half-formed, voices overlapping into a low chant, names forgotten. Blood remembered. Tell them. Nora's throat tightened. Tell who? There's no one left here. There is you. And in that instant she understood, the hollow didn't need vengeance anymore. It needed a witness. The air went cold. The heartbeat stopped, then, silence so deep it swallowed her thoughts. She hit record once more. This is my last entry, she said slowly. I've learned that history doesn't vanish, it just waits for someone to listen. What happened here wasn't a haunting. It was a remembrance. Lightning cracked across the sky, lighting up the oak in blinding white. For a single frame, her camera caught them, dozens of figures standing among the roots, faces calm, eyes closed, as if finally at rest. Then everything went black. Days later, a highway patrol found her car abandoned near the worksite, recorder on the passenger seat, still running. The file was 4 hours long. And the first 3 minutes, her voice could be heard describing the oak, the box, the smell of rain. After that, nothing. But a soft, steady beat, thump, 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 until, near the very end, one faint whisper, we remember. When her producer uploaded the raw audio as the finale of Echoes of the South, it broke every record the show had ever seen. Listeners reported hearing different patterns in the background, old hymns, chains, prayers, laughter, thunder. Each playback seemed unique, as though the story were alive, reshaping itself for whoever dared to listen. No one ever found Nora Whitfield, but every year, on October 12th, the anniversary of her disappearance, her podcast feed updates on its own with a single blank episode, no title, no description. Press play, and you'll hear that same heartbeat, and if you listen long enough, some say you'll hear a woman's voice say softly, "Tell the truth. Then tell your own." They say the earth forgets that after enough years, enough rain, enough silence, the ground closes over and the stories fade, but the hollow never did. Every storm, every echo, every breath of wind that bends the grass still carries their names: Silas, Ada, Hester, Nora, and all the others who dared to listen, because some stories aren't meant to be buried, they're meant to live, in whispers and waves, in the static between the words. And if you listen close enough, you'll hear it still, that soft, patient heartbeat beneath the noise, not a curse, not a ghost, just the truth, refusing to stay quiet. And maybe that's what Elder's Hollow always was, not a place, but a reminder that the past isn't behind us, that it's beneath us, waiting. That if you've made it this far into the story, thank you for listening, but don't stop here, because the past still has more to say. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Dark history, forgotten legends, and voices the world tried to silence that we share. New tales every day, each one a glimpse into the shadows of time, where memory meets mystery. And remember, every story you hear leaves an echo. The question is, can you tell which ones are still alive?